And greetings, folks. It's me again, back again with another video. I'm reacting to the question if Spain and Portugal united. So, hope you do enjoy this video. Like, subscribe, follow me on Amino, TikTok, and Discord. And enough chit chat. Let's begin, shall we?
Spain and Portugal, two neighbors who historically have shared much, from foes to faith, from goals to government. But despite said common ground, including the very common grounds they occupy on the Iberian Peninsula, these neighbors have held less a rivalry with each other and more a quiet animosity. Their inception came as offshoots of the remnant Visigoth kingdom of Asturias, which at the time had been the sole bastion of Christendom in Iberia following the Islamic conquests of the Umayyad Caliphate. The result was a gradual formation of the small Iberian kingdoms of Castile and Portugal, each having distinctly been influenced by the cultures of Leon and Galicia respectively. As the period of Reconquista carried forward, so did Portugal take to expanding its reach southward as an independent force. Castile, however, would bring Galicia and Leon as well as other newly conquered lands under its own crown in a consolidation of power. This period would also see the rise of Aragon in the east, who too contributed to the Christian reconquest of Iberia. As Portugal found itself reaching the end of southward expansion, so did it suddenly find itself blocked off from the east by the Castilian capture of Seville. Castile, who now stood roughly 3 times Portugal's size, was seemingly taking position as the dominant force of Iberia, securing this further through its union with Aragon and Navarre into the Kingdom of Spain. Later, the discovery of the Americas in 1492 would only help cement Spain's place as a leading world power, having relegated Portuguese claims to only but the coasts of Brazil, though also granting it full claims to Africa and Asia, where Portugal had successfully established a series of thriving port colonies. The two kingdoms, since their foundation and even prior, had crossed blades at various points, most commonly over issues of succession and right of Portuguese sovereignty, and it'd be through this that the two would gradually solidify their alliances to either England or France, though France had tended to change sides depending on whether it perceived a greater threat from England or Spain. In the late 1500s, Portugal's young King Sebastian, who held ambitions of launching a crusade against the Islamic Kingdom of Morocco, finally saw his opportunity in what became the Moroccan succession crisis. In 1578, with an army of 17,000, Sebastian took off to Morocco, from where he never returned. Though his body was never found, Sebastian's uncle, King Philip II of Spain, had claimed to have received and buried it sometime after the Battle of the Three Kings. Now left without an immediate heir, Sebastian's throne was left open and eventually claimed by his uncle, finally uniting Portugal and Spain under a single crown and what would come to be known as the Iberian Union. But as we can see today, it was not one to last. King Philip of Spain was almost infamous as the man who took the empire from its head of power and lost everything through mismanagement of its colonies, aggressive policy against what should have been natural allies, and reckless expenditure of wealth and resources on fruitless efforts. The Portuguese, though at least in part tolerant of Philip's succession during its beginnings, came to resent what had been a seeming repression of the people's culture, exclusive taxation practices, and replacement of Portuguese nobility and leadership with those of Spain's own. The succession came to feel more a conquest and a conversion than a mere unity, a feeling which would not improve over the years as Spain's decline cost Portugal its own opportunities to ascend. The Iberian Union, having only lasted 60 years, would ultimately come to an end with the Portuguese Restoration War, a conflict which would lock the two kingdoms in continuous conflict for some 28 years, a span which some say actually extends the Union's duration to 88 years, though this still doesn't paint a very inspiring image of the Spanish-Portuguese relationship, and so the Union fell. Portugal would go on to pursue meager colonial prospects, satisfied with its major holdings in Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique, remaining a close ally to England over the years. Spain, under continued external pressures and the diminishing quality of leadership brought about by generations of inbreeding, eventually led to the War of Spanish Succession, as claimed Spanish holdings shifted between the Austrian Habsburgs and the French House of Bourbon. The Spanish throne ultimately coming under Bourbon domain, while local Spanish territories in Europe were ceded to Austria. The later years would see Napoleon attempt to unite Spain and France under his own dynasty, at which point the majority of Spain's colonies would break away, leaving the empire a husk of what it once was. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate world the conditions of the Iberian Union had been improved to the point that Spain and Portugal endure and move on to an era of achievement, as had been seen for Castile in its path to becoming Spain? The Portuguese are a prime factor, of course. Public opinion must be in favor of the Union or risk the dangers of another Restoration War. Portuguese interests also need to be fairly tended to in this new government, instead of swept aside as they had been in our world. One proposal is that instead of the union forming through the succession of King Philip, it instead forms through a union of crowns in which Sebastian returns from the Battle of the Three Kings and goes on to marry King Philip's daughter, Isabella Eugenia. whom he had proposed to just months before his disappearance. Yes, Eugenia technically would have been Sebastian's cousin, but what else would you expect from the Spanish Habsburgs? With Sebastian, the Portuguese king, taking the throne, so would Portugal find itself with greater representation, while Spain would be happy to just find itself in more capable hands, except it wouldn't be, since Philip would still remain king and blow the country's budget on fruitless crusades against the Dutch, English, and Ottomans, literally until his death, meaning no salvation for Spain and the end of Portuguese friendship with Britain, and well, not much different than what transpired in our world. So while it's an additional and unlikely stretch, for the sake of this scenario, we're going to suggest that soon after Sebastian's marriage, King Philip suddenly dies, leaving Sebastian to claim the throne as the heir apparent. Sebastian immediately would take to improving diplomacy with France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. England, being a friend to Portugal and Sebastian himself, would serve as a mediation point to resolve conflicts with the Dutch Protestants in a war which would have otherwise consumed tremendous amounts of the Empire's resources. In the end, resolving to recognize the independence of the Dutch Republic, while Iberia retained the southern Catholic Netherlands, an earlier but otherwise similar resolution to that growing timeline. To Sebastian, the true concerns for Iberia's faith were those most local to the peninsula, primarily the growing populations of French Protestants to the east and the Islamic coasts to the south. With a focus on continuing conflicts with Morocco, perhaps spreading further along the Barbary coast to further solidify Iberian dominance of the Mediterranean and put an end to the much despised Islamic pirates of the region, who at the time would become more active and cause significant turmoil for much of Europe. On military matters, Sebastian would take to reforming the entirety of the Iberian army as he had that in Portugal, ensuring rules and restrictions were enforced, while also commissioning the enlargement of the Armada to better control the local Mediterranean and conduct regular voyages between the Old and New World, settling more aggressively the territories of the Caribbean, Mexico, and Brazil, furthering the Catholic faith as his uncle had, though taking
I've always loved art like that. Always loved art like that.
Cooperate in further securing and developing the Western Inland territories.
Always loved that medieval art.
Tribes under better organized rule, ideally favoring tribes who converted to Catholicism or intermarried their elites to the Iberian colonials. Domestically, Sebastian would establish a series of social reforms, including the establishment of a credit and resource lending system for business.
Meanwhile, in Britain, the Catholic Church wouldn't give Henry VIII a divorce from his wife at the time.
Essentially paving the way for a more advanced retail-based system than the peddlers and common markets at the time. Seeing the establishment of government and privately owned shops who bought product in bulk from the source and sold it alongside similar products.
So I said, to hell with the Catholic Church, I'm going to start my own church.
This process would give greater value to the best farmers and producers.
And the people at the time said, oh, this is devilry, this is devil's work. And guess where the church is now? Guess where the Catholic Church is now?
Speaking of which, with Philip gone and relations remaining strong with England, the Spanish Armada is never destroyed. However, English naval technology would continue to advance at a more rapid pace and certainly would beat out the Iberian Navy if conditions remained unchanged. And once again, though expansion in the New World would continue, prime focus for Sebastian would be on the Ottomans and Islamic world, further conquering the Philippines as a counter to the Islamic presence in Indonesia, as well as pushing further into North Africa with the aim of retaking the island of Cyprus for the Holy League. Iberia would play a supporting role in 30 years more, aiding the Austrians in their expulsion of Protestantism from the Holy Roman Empire. This, paired with already existing tensions over trade routes, would trigger a resurgence of conflict between Spain and the Netherlands, while their mutual ally of England would refuse to involve itself. Though Iberia would not be perceived as a true member of the House of Habsburg, relations with Austria would remain strong out of a sense of maintaining the alliance's historical strength, and in hopes that a member of the House of Habsburg would marry back into the role of king once again. France, threatened by the Iberian-Austrian alliance, would take advantage of this conflict by beginning the Franco-Iberian War. However, unlike in our timeline with the Franco-Spanish War, France would be thoroughly defeated. Time would go on, and though it would seem Iberia still dominated, in the decades following the Franco-Iberian War, the empire would have noticeably slowed down, allowing in that time the Netherlands, France, and Britain to become more prominent forces in colonial holdings and in trade. Internally, Iberia too would begin to notice a decline in organization and policy, enough for several to begin seeing the South American colonies as much more favorable homes away from the troubles of the peninsula. The issue, as expected with this royal line, would have been inbreeding, which by this point had produced a sickly and feeble heir to the throne not long for this world, and just as in our world with the decline of Spain, would come to spell the end of this prolonged golden age. However, not before one final shakeup, as France had throughout this time set its sights on knocking the Iberians down to size, determined to seize their place in the world and ensure that the next golden age belonged to the French. At the same time, in pursuit of these ambitions, France had made a thoroughly souring relation with the Netherlands and Britain, who had briefly come under the same monarch, William of Orange. The 9 Years' War, as it would come to be known, would be complicated by the sudden death of the Iberian king, which would thus lead until the War of Iberian Succession, as the houses of Habsburg and Bourbon grapple over what was to be done with the Iberian throne. Ultimately, with the greater leverage earned from Iberia's greater prospects and achievements, the Habsburgs succeed in placing their successor, Archduke Charles, on the throne. However, concessions are made to ensure a balance of power and ensure the French remain appeased with this resolution, primarily seeing to it that the Iberian and Austrian crowns remain separate for all times to prevent the creation of a supreme Habsburg empire that would dominate Europe. This dividing Habsburg territories into those domestic in Europe and in North Africa to be overseen by Austria, and those abroad to remain colonial possessions of Iberia, with whom remained the majority in power. France would earn claim to Corsica, the majority of Sardinia, Florida, and the Bahamas as personal ports in the much-desired Caribbean and Mediterranean. In this arrangement, Britain would also claim the ports of Gibraltar and those of the Lesser Antilles to secure its own trade interests from Habsburg monopolization, setting the stage for the new chief kingdoms of Britain and France, though with Austria primed to become an even greater player on the home front. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The USMC, thanks for watching.
Hope you all enjoyed the video. Like, subscribing. Yes, go check out Monsieur Z's channel. Follow me on Amino, TikTok, and Discord. And God bless y'all for the support. And I'll see you next video.